Yeah, hello, and welcome to our spotlight in February 2022, to our special spotlight session. My name is Uli Weinberg, and I'm the director of the School of Design Thinking in Potsdam in Germany. Currently, I'm in Vienna right now on a workshop, and that is why I will sneak out pretty soon out of that session. Unfortunately, but we are in the middle of a practical exercise here in Vienna. So they let me out to just say hello to all of you, and especially to our very welcome special guest, Professor Jeanne Liedtka. But I'm very happy that Joanne Halpern, the HPI director in New York, she will run you through the afternoon session, or it is in Germany, in Europe, it's the afternoon session or the morning session or the evening session at your places. And I'm really happy that we had so many applications. There was more than 100. We have now 50 people in this call. I'm pretty sure there will be some more joining pretty soon. And before I sneak out here, I would like to give a little secret actually, because it's not published yet. We'll do a spotlight special in March, and especially on the 10th of March. And you'll find more information pretty soon on the website, and it will be together with IEEE and the Vienna University, where I'm right now. And it will all about the new standard, the IEEE 7000 standard on ethical-based design or ethical-based engineering. And we have very special guest, the director from IEEE, who is responsible for the new standard, which got announced publicly in November last year, first time in Europe, and there was no real worldwide release yet. And we have a longer session, and we decided together with IEEE and Professor Sarah Spiekermann, who is kind of the mental person in the back, who was through the past 6 years defining that standard. We decided to have a digital event together with the GDTA members. And the GDTA is the Global Design Thinking Alliance, now consisting of about 25 academic institutions all around the planet in 5 continents. And we are very happy that we can host that special event on the March 10th. So mark it in your calendars, and Joanne will talk about it later at the end. But now first enjoy the talk of Jeanne Liedtka. It's the second time that we got her as a guest here at the GDTA Spotlight, and I'm so happy, and we are all so happy that Jeanne is also with her institution a member of the Global Design Thinking Alliance. But I hand over now to Joanne to New York. Please, Joanne, you are the host now. Thanks a lot and enjoy.
Okay, thank you, Uli, and welcome, Jeanne, and welcome to everybody who is here today. So I'd like to start by just giving a brief introduction of Jeanne. Most of you know Jeanne. I mean, if you've been in the design thinking field for any length of time, I'm sure you've encountered Jeanne's numerous books and articles. So Jeanne is the United Technologies Corporation Professor of Business Administration at the University of Virginia's Darden Graduate School of Business. And she's the former Chief Learning Officer at United Technology Corporation. And there she oversaw all the activities associated with corporate learning and development, executive education, career development processes, and learning portal and web-based activities. And she was also the former dean of the associate dean of the MBA program and the executive director of the Batten Institute. So Jeanne, I mean, I could go on forever. You've done so many interesting things, but what we're going to do now is we're going to let Jeanne talk, and she's going to discuss measuring design thinking competencies and building experimentation skills. So Jeanne, I'm going to give the floor to you, and it's all yours.
Great, thank you, Joanne. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. not exactly sure. Make sure I'm sharing the correct one. Terrific. Now, can everyone see the screen?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. Great. Well, I'm so excited to be here. I always enjoy the conversations with you so much. Being a professor at a business school and loving design thinking can sometimes be a pretty lonely experience. So the opportunity to work with the GDTA has really been important to me, and your feedback and input on the work we're doing at Darden is just so incredibly helpful. So I'm excited today to introduce some new work that around teaching materials that we've been working on. And I see my co-author on part of this work, Karen Hold, is on the call too. So thanks for joining us, Karen. And she's an invaluable resource that maybe we'll be able to turn to during the Q&A. But essentially what I want to do today is I want to kind of build on this research that we've been doing and give you a sense of where we are now. So for really over a decade now at Darden, we've been tracking rather closely the learning experience of our students, many of whom are MBAs, also executives. We were an early participant in the Coursera kind of MOOC movement, and we've stayed involved and just been amazed at the number of people around the world that we've met. We partnered with Karen's organization in DC, Design Thinking DC, to do some more research. And then we have a new partnership with two different design consultancies that are really at the top of their game, really three exactly, Treehouse, David Kester and Associates, and Peer Insight. And a lot of the work we'll be presenting today is really from this new partnership that we've formed with them, but it's all based on this tracking of the learners' journals using diagnostic instruments and diaries and check-ins and all of the things we've been doing on an ongoing basis with our students. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is a new instrument that we've developed based on this research that is aimed at measuring design thinking competencies. We're calling them design thinking competencies, but actually, when you actually look at the behaviors that we're talking about, they're more generally innovation-related behaviors than just specifically related to design thinking. For instance, the term design thinking doesn't really show up anywhere in the instrument other than its title. But the instrument has, we have both a self-assessment portion of that, and a number of you on this call have taken that already, and thank you very much for doing that. We look forward to your feedback. I'll talk a little bit at the end for people who haven't had a chance to take it, but might want to take it and give us some feedback. We're also working on a peer version of that I'm experimenting in my MBA classes, in which peer teams evaluate each other. But essentially, all of this work is based on this kind of underlying premise in our most recent research, which is that to deepen a learner's design thinking practice, to really do design well, goes beyond teaching tools and methods, and essentially involves our students becoming someone different in exciting kinds of ways, I think. So essentially, if we look at each stage of the design thinking process, like data gathering and the associated tools like ethnographic research that we teach, what is happening as students engage in those activities is they are having a deep experience themselves. And that experience is kind of the foundation for changing who they are. So as part of that, these experiences, each stage produces a unique kind of experience that encourages particular kinds of new behaviors and mindsets, whether it's the data gathering stage with the experience of immersion that produces the development of empathy and self-awareness, or the sense-making stage, where students are gathering inquiry skills and honing their perception, or all the way through to the final kind of learning and action stage of experimentation, where students are really learning how to use data to adapt on an ongoing basis and to look for disconfirming data and a whole new set of behaviors that are of interest. So behind each of these phases, we have identified a set of behaviors, and these are observable, concrete, pretty straightforward behaviors. I've included some examples here. For instance, in the immersion experience, we're working to develop emotional engagement. In sense making, teaching students how to dig. In the emergent stage, we're trying to help students postpone this experience of premature compromise, which we know they love to do. So we've taken those particular behaviors and compiled them into the instrument that's aimed at what we call minimum viable competencies. And actually, minimum viable competencies is kind of an unusual term, but we selected it quite deliberately, playing on the language of minimum viable products. Some earlier research that I had presented in the past at GDTA that looks at the return on investment question and what are the outcomes produced at design thinking, looked at those outcomes relative to the level of experience of the individuals reporting the outcomes. And one of the quite interesting takeaways from that research was that as we think of moving our learners along a continuum from beginner to expert, and again, in our database, we're talking about not professional designers, people who are non-designers who've not received official legitimate design training. But as we look at moving them in the design thinking competency development from beginner through to expert, it is the intermediate stage, which is most statistically significant related to outcomes. So as a beginner, we see some modest set of outcomes. The big jump in performance is when we move students from beginner level skills to intermediate. And so that's why we started to think about this notion of what is the minimum viable level in each of these competencies that allows us to maximize what we know are the truly transformational benefits that are available with design thinking. So that's the MVC notion. So how we've started to use this instrument in class. I mean, we had a very modest Qualtrics version of it available for class last year. And thanks to our partnership with Treehouse Innovation, we now have a much cooler, fun version of the instrument that I'm working with currently. But essentially, it has allowed us to take different approaches in the classroom. So with my MBAs in my current semester-long design class, we ask them to complete a self-assessment in the first week of class, just as they're starting, when most of them don't really even know what design thinking is. But again, because the behaviors don't use the design thinking language, they're able to self-assess things like how active they are as a listener, how aware they are of their own biases, these kinds of issues. And then as the class progresses at different stages, we ask the project teams to provide peer feedback on other teammates using the peer instrument. So between those, we're able to help people self-assess, and then we're able to give them feedback from others around the same set of behaviors. Other faculty members that are kind of piloting the instrument for us have used it in the form of doing a self-assessment at the beginning and then at the end of class as a different approach. Treehouse, working with business clients exclusively, is using it for things like performing organizational audits of design thinking skills or team development activities. So there are a lot of different uses of this, but what I have personally found in the classroom is that it has given us the ability to work at two parallel levels in our development of design thinking skills. So at one level, students are focused on their projects and on the different processes and new tools they're learning. But on the other end, they're also in parallel focused in on their own personal capabilities and thinking about which capabilities are their strengths or their development opportunities, and which ones they want to focus on as we move through the class. This has been a big help for me. One of the problems I've always had is students become obsessed with their projects. And I suspect others have the same experience. They they lose track of the fact that this is actually supposed to be about their learning and their development of competencies. And this has been a nice way to remind them of that. And combined with some journaling we do on a weekly basis, I think we've really seen a much more sophisticated and energized kind of attention to this issue of individual capabilities. So another thing that we've begun to work with the instrument on, and I'm particularly excited about this, is to begin to look for ways to talk about these competencies that we've developed in our students in broader, in some ways more compelling language for people who are outside of the design thinking world that we so value. So we've done some preliminary factor analysis of the first 200 completed instruments, self-assessment instruments, that was basically a convenient sample that the authors, Karen and I, and other authors and the folks at Treehouse, people gathered through our LinkedIn connections and things like that. Intriguingly, several statistically significant factors emerged with eigenvalues of 1 or more that point to me to an interesting take on the capability sets that we are building with our students. So I've shown you these 7 factors and what we have named them in our work. And they range from inclusive conversation skills, which of course we associate very directly with design thinking and the development of empathy and active listening and open-mindedness in terms of these interactions, through some very interesting scientific reasoning skills. I thought I'd just show you some examples of how this looks for some of the different skills. So there's one category we've called the divergent thinking skills, and those are very familiar to us. If you look at the particular items in the instrument that are clustering under this particular factor, they're very familiar to those of us teaching design thinking. You know, trying to get students to look broadly for opportunities, focusing on needs and beliefs, controlling their need for closure, being possibility driven, avoiding premature allegiance to solutions. Nothing very new there. But it's also picked out a factor like the provocateur skills, we've called them. And these are really the challenging skills, an extraordinarily important set of skills associated with being able to productively challenge both the status quo and their teammates. And I love the way that the factor analysis has called out this particular category of skills that I personally have never really emphasized as an outcome associated with design thinking. Similarly, there's a set of scientific reasoning skills. We might call them the hypothesis-driven skill set, which is really about a very objective way of gathering data and designing and conducting rigorous experiments, using data to alter and pivot or even abandon new ideas. So again, this is very preliminary research, and as the size of our sample set gets bigger, I think we'll be able to refine it even more. But I'm really intrigued to think about where we might go in terms of our work as educators in thinking about this broad set of different competencies that we are in fact teaching as part of the design thinking process, but not necessarily recognizing in our teaching, and that have broad applicability besides design thinking or even just innovation, I think. So associated with that, these scientific reasoning skills have been particularly interesting to me. I have generally felt in my own teaching that the single weakest element in my teaching of the design thinking process is around those final stages of experimentation. I believe that the nature of the front end, we have a very rich set of tools and a pretty clear process. I've often felt that at the back end, we get to experiment and we tell students to go off and design an experiment, when in fact, students and business people have no real idea how to design an experiment. So another aspect of work that we've been doing lately, and this one is in fact very preliminary, but is to try and dig down and think about how we might provide more hands-on, step-by-step guidance to our students as they as we move them into the area experimentation. We've had a lot of luck with this in the front end of the process. We've created a Designing for Growth field book, which is really what we use with students both virtually and in the classroom, that kind of guides them along. So our goal here was to build that same kind of field book, but for experimentation. And for experimentation writ large, not just specifically related to design thinking, but that could also be used in areas like agile software development, lean startup, the many other business areas that increasingly look to experimentation as a focus of the work they're doing. So we've just started. Oh, I forgot to do my little message here. As we wrap up on the survey instrument, for anyone who's interested either in thinking through more how they might use it, the folks at Treehouse Innovation have been working extensively with it and are doing really interesting and terrific things. Urge you to reach out to them. And for those of you who haven't taken the instrument, if you would like to, for about another 24 hours, the discount link is open, which will allow you to take it for free. And the information is here, and I encourage you to do that. But back now, apologies, to the experiment side. So we've been creating this field guide in which we've tried to identify a specific set of processes embedded under this kind of larger category of experimentation. And of course, it starts with identifying testable ideas. One of the big challenges that I face, whether we're talking to business people or MBA students, is the fact that people believe they can test products and services independent of who they've been designed for. So a lot of the work here is just helping to set up this notion of what is a testable idea, which requires that you have a value proposition, you have a target market, you understand the needs that we're going to deliver to that, and that you then use that to establish a set of proof points and indicators and surfacing of assumptions. You then select an approach, you build prototypes, you execute experiments, you analyze the results and iterate and learn. I mean, familiar to all of us at an abstract level. We're trying to dig a level deeper and begin to build some templates. This is the one for assumption surfacing. That use some of the basic models out of design thinking around this notion of desirability, feasibility, viability, but they help take those more abstract notions and help students to translate them into something concrete that they can kind of get their arms around. One of the things I'm really excited about is the particular piece on how to design an experiment. This is something that I've looked both in the academic literature and in the practical literature, even in areas like lean startup that have talked about experimentation for a very long time and have been frustrated at the lack of specificity to really work with students on. And so here as a preliminary pass, and again, this is working with two other really outstanding design consultancies that I've been privileged to work with that do a lot of this work. That's Peer Insight, headquartered in Washington, D.C., and David Kester Associates, headquartered in London. And just by studying their process and talking together and working, we've identified this kind of decision tree to help students think about how to design an experiment that kind of focuses on a particular set of questions and helps them to think through very specific issues like at what stage do you test components of the experiment versus the whole experiment? What do you need in terms of what we might call say data obtainable through things like cognitive walkthroughs with storyboards versus do data that often requires a more sophisticated set of experiments, simulations or trials or whatever. And so we are excited to continue to develop this and look forward to having something more concrete, perhaps, to show you at some point and get your feedback on. So that's basically it. The two areas, the measuring competencies, which I think we are making a good deal of progress on and seeing the benefits of in our classes. And then this question of building out the kind of experimental toolkit and process, which is at a more preliminary level, but is something that we're also very excited about. So that's the update from Darden. And I really look forward to the opportunity to get your feedback on this, both the instrument or your thoughts on your teaching of experimentation and what would be helpful to you. And with that, perhaps I will stop sharing and turn it back over to you, Joanne, to take it from here.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeanne. And one of the things I was thinking about when you're talking is to really, this is another way to get faculty buy-in for design thinking and you're showing the skills that are being acquired while you're doing this. And they're saying, oh, these are competencies or skill competencies that we are trying to achieve in our teaching. So I think this is a really interesting, but thank you so much. Fantastic talk. And now we're going to open it up to questions. So if anybody has questions for Jeanne, please raise your hand and we will open it up to you. And if not, I have some questions for you, but we'll need to see. I don't see anybody. Oh yes, we do have one right here. Mats, please.
Yeah, well, I can start off. Thank you for a very, very interesting presentation and sort of going in directions that I've been thinking about, but I haven't been able to do anything about it. So very interesting. I can start off with a couple of questions. The first is, you said that this was a semester-long course. If you have a 2-semester system, that's almost 20 weeks. So in that case, how many hours a week do they put into this design thinking class? That's my first question. And the other one was you mentioned that you saw that a commonality between methods in software development, startups, and design thinking. So, and could you enlarge a bit on these commonalities and what sort of commonalities you see?
Well, I'll take the first question first. We do have a semester-long class. So for us, that is 14 weeks with the students. They meet in class about 3 hours per week. But because it is a project-based class for actual clients, they spend much more time out of class working on their projects than they spend in class. So this class is a real luxury at the business school, where almost all of our classes are 7 weeks. They are quarter classes rather than semester classes. So I have the privilege of working with a relatively small group of students. The class size maximizes at 40. So I really get to work with these 40 students from the middle of January to early May. So the competency development and the ability to use peer feedback at different stages of the design thinking process to try and focus their attention on their own development and not just on this project that they're so anxious about has been really helpful. We also have a 7-week introduction to design thinking class taught by a faculty colleague of mine, Rachel Brzezinski. Rachel is using the new instrument this coming semester for the first time, and she will not use the peer evaluation aspect of it because they aren't really doing real projects in a 7-week basis. They're kind of doing pseudo projects. So you don't have the level of ability to give legitimate feedback on peers that I have in my longer class, but she'll be using the self-assessment definitely at the beginning of class and possibly at the end of class to kind of give students an opportunity to reflect on their own personal assessment of their process. So I think depending upon the amount of time we've got, certainly in an organizational context where you've got development teams learning and design thinking process, you can pace the feedback to almost whatever amount of time the team has to work with. So that's been very interesting. Your second question, Mats, on the relationship of things like Agile and Lean Startup to design thinking. I think those are particularly noticeable at that experimental back end. I think design thinking makes a huge contribution to Lean Startup and Agile, for instance, in the front end, because we begin with user needs. And often in an Agile process or a Lean Startup process, they begin with the idea already, right? And so those processes can really benefit from the addition of a front end of design thinking. However, once you've got the idea, I think essentially design thinking and these other methods look a lot alike, depending upon the sophistication level of the kind of experimental process, but essentially they're all about experimentation, and they're all about helping students to manage the investment risk of a new idea and to learn how to progress from kind of low fidelity prototypes and fast and expensive experiments to more sophisticated, higher fidelity prototypes and experiments. And so I think what we're already doing in design thinking and what other people are doing in these other areas have a lot in common, and we can really work on these experimentation skills quite independently of the design thinking front end. So I think that's why I'm excited about the new phase of work around experimentation.
Thank you, Jeanne. So we have a lot of questions coming in. First from Ilona Diva-Losa, how do you measure the evolution? One assessment at the beginning and one after having finished a design thinking class or a design thinking project, maybe one in between? I mean, you did mention the peer feedback, but maybe you could just expand on that.
Okay. I think self-assessments have very useful, albeit limited capabilities, right? We're asking learners to self-assess where they are in a set of behaviors. Now, the behaviors are pretty concrete, normal behaviors, so they're capable of doing that. But of course, you know, what we often see in students is an upward bias. You know, we have a scale of 1 to 10. I was just looking at a different group who was sampling this, and like everyone was a 7 on everything, right? So the real value of the self-assessment, I think, is to focus learners on a particular set of capabilities and to surface their own thinking about their strengths and developmental opportunities, right? The rubber really hits the road with skill development when you introduce kind of 360 feedback or peer feedback. That is, now they're getting a read on how others see them, right? And so for me, the combination of self-assessment and the kind of peer review is really very important. And for organizations, for instance, that are interested in auditing their current level of design thinking capabilities and progress, for instance, after introducing some educational experiences and workshops in design thinking, I think you have to go to peer review, because we even see in our samples cultural differences in kind of the degree of humility culturally people bring to these kinds of assessments. So self-assessment is a teaching device to me to help people begin to think about their own personal development. If I think back to my days as a chief learning officer, right? So much of development is around attention focusing and getting people to acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses and getting them to actively make a choice about the areas they want to commit to getting better at, right? As opposed to imposing that on them. So the self-assessment is excellent for that. And then, you know, I'm a real believer in the peer assessment. I don't do a second self-assessment at the end of class because at that point, I think we do a lot of journaling in class too. So students see by reflecting back on their journals what their progress has been. So for instance, students basically do a journey map of their own experience in the class as their final assignment in this class, in addition to the report out to the clients on the project. And in the process of going back through their journals and reconstructing their journey, they really come to an appreciation, a kind of a personal evaluation of where they have learned and where they remain in need of development. And for me, and in my class, that's really enough.
And Jeanne, I also think, you know, the fact that we're mentioning, so they actually see the skills that we're trying to, you know, or the competencies. I mean, often the students don't realize what professors are trying to achieve. And I think this is also important to make them aware of these competencies.
And I think they also recognize in that case that we are teaching lifelong skills for an uncertain world. Sure, the name of my class is design thinking. But in fact, especially I think when you look at this factor analysis and the range of skills pop up, those are even not just innovation skills, they are skills for ongoing adaptation in a world of uncertainty and change. And so I think calling that out and helping students to understand they may not do design thinking in their jobs after graduation at all, right? Most of them won't. Hardly any of them will at a place like Darden. But they are learning a set of skills that, whether they're in product management or even in finance or whatever they go into, is going to really help them adapt in their careers.
And also when they become managers, they'll understand these are also important skills for the people that they're managing. So
exactly.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions. So Marjolaine, you were the first, so why don't you start?
Thank you very much. And Professor Liedtka, thank you. I'm a huge fan of your work and I'm very excited to hear about the latest. So we also work with MBA students, executive MBA students, and it's interesting to me that in their curriculum, usually there's a lot of emphasis on pretty much the opposite of design thinking. So it's about the do-know mind. It's about being the expert. And so bringing design thinking in really turns their world upside down in many respects, which is very exciting. I was just wondering if you could maybe reflect on, from your experience working with MBA students, business students, what are the one or two areas that, and of course it varies per person, but what have you seen as sort of the real sticky areas? And perhaps even if you have the time, because lots of people have lots of questions, but sort of your biggest aha around how to help students through that particular area of challenge for them.
Yes. One of the things that we have learned, and is very obvious, is that student personalities affect which stage of design thinking is difficult for them. We have a slide that I wish I had incorporated now in the presentation, but I didn't, that uses the DISC instrument. And possibly many of you are familiar with the DISC. Probably next to the Myers-Briggs, it's the most common kind of personality or leadership indicator. We've used it both in our research and in class now for about 12 years. The DISC, for instance, has the category that is I for influencer. And people who are predominantly influencers pretty much love everything about design thinking. I mean, they love the front end, they love going back out and testing with people. They just, if you look at their journey map, it's almost all highs. You look at a C, which in the DISC is a high conscientious person, a perfectionist, a data person, an analytic type person. They really struggle in the front end of design thinking with developing empathy. They're terrified of doing ethnographic interviews. Sense making overwhelms them because it's too much data and they can't fit it in an Excel spreadsheet, which is how they've been taught to work with data. But then they get to the experimentation part. And once they understand the difference between the traditional analytic approaches they've been taught and a hypothesis-driven use of data, they really like it. Because we all know extrapolating data from the past, which is what 90% of the data analytics and MBA programs do, is not a very useful coping mechanism in a world of uncertainty where the future doesn't map the past. So they understand that learning how to use data in a hypothesis-driven way is a really invaluable skill. So they get all excited about that part. And that begins to really, to me, work against this bizarre realization that as quantitatively oriented as our MBA students are, they do not really know how to work with data in a creative context. They don't know how to assess a future that isn't here already, where they don't have an Excel spreadsheet full of historic data on it that they can just extrapolate into the future. So, so again, depending upon where students are coming from and even their basic personalities, they struggle at different places. We try and create teams quite explicitly that have a mix of DISC types, because what we also know from our research is that the more different DISC types are on a team, the more uncomfortable it is for the students and the more they struggle with each other, but the higher quality of the output of the project. I mean, projects clearly, grades on projects track the diversity of DISC types on a team. It's pretty remarkable. So, I think there's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts in this: personalities, what they've been trained to do. I call design thinking at Darden the land of the misfit toys, because anyone, it's an elective class, so anyone who ends up in it probably hasn't felt comfortable in the rest of the program in some ways. So they're willing and they're interested, and they give me a lot of room to make them uncomfortable, which is what you need in these classes. Students need to be willing to step into discomfort and learn new things and not know what they're doing for a long period while you wait for the payoff of design thinking. So it's really, the MBAs are particularly challenging, I think, to teach this material to, and it takes a lot of goodwill and structure. I mean, we're so structured because they panic and you lose them so quickly. I could talk about this forever, but I know we have other questions, but thank you. As someone else toiling in the fields with the MBAs, it's a unique set of challenges.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, and Jeanne, you mentioned the discomfort. I mean, it's easy to tell people to go outside their comfort zone, but to get them to be willing to do that and show that vulnerability it's not easy. Now, Savine and then Raluca. Savine, you had actually had a question on the chat a long time ago. So why don't you start and then Raluca afterwards?
All right. Okay. Thank you so much once again. And Jeanne, when you spoke about the qualitative data analysis, I was recollecting the last seminar that we had, and you went really deep into that. So my question here is mainly about the peer review feedback mechanism that you've added to this. Is how do we run this in an organizational setup where the reviewer may not have worked with me as a professional on a design thinking project? So,
well, I think the good news is you're not asking them about design thinking per se. So you're asking them, are they an active listener? Right? Are they aware of their own biases? Are they able to recognize disconfirming data and work with it? So you do need people who have worked fairly closely. So with the MBA teams, we don't have much choice, right? You've got an intact design team, and the good news is they're working with each other quite extensively. The bad news is they're not really comfortable giving each other feedback, and the numbers are small enough that you really can't guarantee anonymity. My project teams are 5 people. So you've got 4 people giving results, and even though it's all anonymized and we don't report who did what, they still are nervous about that. In a business context, what we've experimented with is people nominate a group of people that they have worked with and that they feel are capable of assessing their capabilities relatively accurately. Because you're right, Sabine, if you pump people who barely know each other into this, you just get gibberish. I mean, it's, you know, you get well, what happens is everyone says nice things because they don't have enough of a commitment to each other to actually ding them on particular behavior. So I think expanding it beyond just the project teams is absolutely doable. I mean, there's no reason why you would even need to do this with an intact project team, I think, but you would need to do it with people who work together and can assess the extent to which people have those skills that we laid out. Do they know how to really investigate something? Are they willing to provoke people in a kind of productive as opposed to cynical negative way? Are they able to create inclusive conversations, right? Are they able to be kind of scientific in their reasoning? And I think there's a lot of work environments where you get the data to assess that are not design thinking specific or even design thinking project specific. Right. So that's my sense. But you're right. They need to know each other well.
Thank you so much for the answer.
Luca.
Hi. So I have a lot of questions, and I'm also a big fan. And my first question is actually around the moving parts you mentioned, because I was thinking how much of an influence the own assessment is connected somehow to the disc type. So you partially answered that, but I'm also curious if it influences their progress. So maybe some people are not according to their personality type, or are not willing maybe to give it a chance, and kind of get lost in the process because of this cultural personality influence. And also the other moving part, I'm curious, you mentioned there's another colleague that teaches an introduction to design thinking. Is it in the same semester that you are teaching your course? And if so, is there an influence, on people taking that course? So maybe their skill set has improved more because they got more contact to design thinking. And is that relevant? So being exposed to different types of training, let's say?
Yeah.
Or is that out of the scope of the research?
Well, the 7-week course is a first-year MBA course that students take at the end of their MBA program on the first year. Mine is a second-year course. So they aren't taught simultaneously to individual students, but about a third of the students in my class have taken that, and about 2/3 have not. And the difference between them is the students who have taken it are much less anxious through the process than the ones who haven't taken it, because the ones who've taken it know what's coming, right? And they know the structure, but they don't outperform the other students in the class. I think that's in part because of the teamwork, and the teams are very important. About half their grade is the team project. So when you get a good team, it really doesn't matter whether they've had design thinking before or not. They figure out how to do it, and they ramp up, and they do a good job. I give the students the DISC feedback and the design thinking competency instrument feedback on the same day. They get them both. So they are able to think about their DISC type and think about in relation to the design thinking process and competencies and how those two relate to each other. The big advantage of the DISC is that people resonate with the outcomes. I mean, it's like Myers-Briggs in that people have this aha recognition of their own strengths and weaknesses. And in particular, you can show them how a particular set of strengths and weaknesses in one context really flip when you get to the innovation context, right? Strengths become weaknesses and vice versa. And so that just opens them up to discomfort. And again, because that's all the battle, right? How do you get students to realize what they don't know and put up with the pain, which is unusual in a lot of our programs? You know, students don't like to be uncomfortable, so we don't make them uncomfortable. But to put up with that discomfort because they think it matters to their own development. And so it seems to work very well to do that.
Okay, P.S. Lakshman, you had a comment on the chat a long time ago, so I'll let you go first. Now you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was on mute. Thank you so much, John. Jeanne, very nice to meet you in this forum. I missed your earlier session. That was some time back. I think so. So I think last year or so, but very glad to see you here. I teach at one of the business schools in India, Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore and Udaipur. One of your colleagues also is teaching there, Saraswati.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So, and that's a bit of a background. We've been, me and another co-faculty, we've been teaching design thinking for the last 11 years with Indian Institute of Management here. And the competency assessment that you presented now is wonderful. And it's very much in, I think a lot of research has gone into it. And now you've got a good body of knowledge around this. So I'm sure it's going to be very, very useful for many of the educators now. And yeah, what we have been doing is that we are also grappling with the assessment. We cannot say competency, but more in terms of what is that the students are taking away after the class. So how do we assess them? Fortunately or unfortunately, we have to assess the students for the grades. which is very unlikely and very unlike in Stanford as well as in HPI. So therefore, we had to come out with something, and we came out something very similar to what you have been doing, but not to this extent. But this is going to be very, very useful for us, and I will reach out to you to know more about this. Yeah, that's about what I want to discuss with you. But coming to the real question, I think Savin has already covered it partially. The next part is, what has been your experience with the organizations? How are they responding to this approach? Do they really want to assess their employees on these factors?
Again, I would have to answer secondhand through Treehouse's experiences, because for the most part, I haven't really worked with this instrument with organizations yet. I expect to, because I think, well, everyone loves filling out instruments, right? I mean, there's something about filling out an instrument that gives legitimacy to a topic. And particularly because Treehouse has brought their amazing design aesthetic to the instrument. It just looks awesome. And so I think it's going to be successful. They have had a lot of interest expressed by their clients at Treehouse, either following development teams. Treehouse has Sprintbase is their main software development project, which is a project management tool. And I think they are excited about this because, again, this allows them to lay a kind of a personal development of competencies on top of Sprintbase's project management competencies, which is very attractive to, chief learning officers and HR and development people. And convenient for us, because I personally believe the only way to really teach design thinking is in the context of a real project. But we know that projects tend to just consume people. And it's very hard to keep them focused on the individual learning while they're doing the project. And so I think this ability to parallel track is very interesting to people. The idea of the organizational audit is also very interesting. I mean, how do organizations know what their existing level of design competency is? And I mean, of course, so much of the design training in organizations is so shallow. It's, the one-day sessions and workshops and all, which we all know don't really change anyone's behavior. So part of the idea here is to try and legitimize a development process that is more expansive than, you have a one-day workshop and everyone plays with Post-it notes. And at the end of it, they believe they can achieve the transformational power of design thinking. It's just ridiculous. And we can show them that with these kind of methods, right? What we're interested in doing now is we have some return on investment data, which looks at organizational outcomes. And it's interesting to compare individual assessments through this instrument with organizational outcomes in terms of what we're accomplishing in terms of design thinking. I think once we manage to get those coupled, we'll really have organizational interest, because it won't just be the human resource people and the development people. It will also be the people who are looking objectively at return on investment in this HR training and development. And so I think we're not there yet, but when we can get there, I think we will dramatically increase organizational interest in this kind of work.
Okay, we had a long time ago question from Joanna Kompos-Zabielska, and then Rael, you'll go afterwards. So I'm just going to read her question. Thank you for sharing the findings of your assessment process. I wonder if your research and practice show that any of the 7 competencies are harder to teach, or maybe that this depends on the initial talents a person starts his or her journey, design thinking learning journey.
Yeah. I agree. Again, part of it goes back to the DISC profile discussion and the personality preferences, what's hard to teach. I mean, for someone who's a perfectionist engineer, the early stage empathy development is really hard to teach. For someone who's already kind of a high influencer, empathetic type person, the experimentation stuff is kind of hard to teach. I think the experimentation stuff, we underestimate how hard that is to teach. So I have taught hypothesis-driven thinking for 25 years because my own background is strategy consulting, and I've taught a strategy consulting elective to the MBAs. I taught for many years. If you're teaching students how to be strategists in a consulting firm, you are teaching them how to be hypothesis-driven in their approach to problem solving. And even these smart MBAs, it would take me weeks of class till they made the switch and actually saw the difference between the way they had traditionally worked with data and what it meant to be hypothesis driven. Now, that's something that you would think would be easy to teach to data driven people, but it's not, because the way they've been trained to use data is different, right? And so they're only used to using data for proof, and they're only used to using it extrapolating from the past. And so you're really teaching a whole new approach to data gathering to these people. So, you know, even the easy parts of those easy ones of those skills theoretically are actually not easy at all if you actually are trying to get to deep practice versus kind of superficial understanding of what you're talking about.
And you're also teaching like this flexibility and unlearning, and
Yes,
there's a lot of
exactly
going on there. Rael, go ahead.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much. I think, you know, throughout your talk, there's been so many things sparking in my mind. I'm going to try and put this into a sort of cohesive question. We also work in the space a lot around, you know, developing and assessing transferable skills or competencies. And I think what's really interesting, what we've seen as well, is that, you know, assessment is great for personal development, where one gives honest answers and it feeds into one's lifelong learning journey. Then I think, you know, you also mentioned the peer assessment, which is fantastic, but as you said, in smaller groups, it's difficult to do that in a sort of a blind peer assessment way. You know, we've been experimenting as well with a third side, which is more a software-based, you know, track assessing and developing people's competencies based on what they do, and challenge-based learning rather than what they say. Because I think what's interesting as well is increasingly what we're seeing is the workplace, or young people, we're hearing from young people in colleges and universities, is that they want to show more than just their diploma or their certificates or their degree, but they want to show something that makes them them and unique. Not just what shows their qualification, but what shows them as an individual. And I think, you know, these transferable skills and innovation skills that, you know, draw from design thinking and various fields is a fantastic opportunity to do that. And I think increasingly in the workplace, employers are looking for that, where you maybe get sort of this, you know, saturation of degrees. Now we're looking for, you know, how do we find individuals that are best suited for the organization or a better fit or what have you. And I'm wondering, you know, that gap of any insights that you might have around sort of removing the biases from, you know, skills of soft skills, because I think also introducing students to things like, you know, obviously design thinking and the nomenclature that goes with it. One is obviously more likely to then say, yes, I definitely value and appreciate diverse perspectives, because that's the self I want to project. And I see as valued. How do we sort of that space between, well, I guess an authentic around the authenticity of these transferable skills and competencies? You know, what does that space mean to you? Yeah. Sorry, it's a bit.
I mean, I think you go to this to the very core notion of the identity that a student comes into class with. It's really funny. 15 years ago, we first tried to do research on innovation with just practicing managers at different levels in an organization. And we would go in and ask them to talk about, you know, what role innovation plays. Overwhelmingly, they told us they had nothing to do with innovation. I mean, 15 years ago, innovation belonged to the R&D area, not to practicing managers. And MBAs would write things on teaching evaluations like, I don't know why you made me learn innovation. I mean, what is it going to have to do with the rest of my life, right? We've seen almost a 180-degree turn now. they all think they're Steve Jobs. I mean, they all come in now and they have this strong identity as an innovative person. That's who they think they are. But underneath that identity, they are terrified because they have no clue how to become this creative person in practice that they think they are in theory. And to me, that's why design thinking is so ideally suited for this generation who want to be told everything and want to be given all this structure, but at the same time see themselves as these free spirits who are, you know, not attached to particular organizations or things like that. So design thinking is kind of a Trojan horse in that way, because it helps them learn a bunch of stuff that helps them become the people they think they are. And I think in part, that's why this is so rewarding to teach to students who want it. Now, I've had to teach it for short periods of time to students who didn't want it, and that is the ultimate futile experience. But for students who want it, I think, when they have that kind of aha, that they now know how to tap into that creative person that they always wanted to be, it can be super powerful. So I feel like for those of us teaching subjects like design thinking in business schools, this is our moment, because to try and do this stuff even 10 years ago was so difficult and so painful, and it was a small section of students who were drawn to it and understood it. Now, a third of our MBA class willingly takes the introduction to design thinking, you know, and that just would have been unheard of not very long ago. So, you know, I do think we have the material of the moment for these guys to really help them live out who they think their authentic person is. I don't know, it's kind of crazy. It's something I reflect on a lot, because I've seen, you know, 20 years of teaching project-based work, watching the kind of project students wanted to work on. You know, when I first started the design thinking class 13 years ago, I could not get a student to do a nonprofit project. Okay, they wanted to work for General Foods, you know, or some big named company to put on their resume. I can't give away a General Foods project in this group. Everyone in the class wanted to do the United Nations project last time, right? Or the food pantry project. They have changed completely in terms of the kind of project work they want. Now they still want to go off and work for Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and all, but they have a very different identity in terms of who they do a free project for. So it's all very interesting. And I think having the opportunity to watch this change in students and the evolution has really been fun as an observer.
I think also the purpose has become a big part of what they're doing, and it's also transformed the companies. Now the companies are to recruit these top students. They're showing. I mean, I work in the SAP offices, and they have a whole floor, just a sustainability and purpose floor. So this is also their way of, for their customers, but also recruiting the top students. So thank you so much, Jeanne, and thank you all of you for your excellent questions. We have, at the end of these, we usually have another 15 to 30 minutes of, so you can stay on and continue talking to Jeanne, but this is the official end. But before I let you go, Uli mentioned it at the beginning. We're working closely with IEEE, and they are introducing something called value-based engineering. And on March 10th, thank you, Steffi, and HPI team for putting this on. So this is the information on March 10th, and you're all welcome to join. It will be online. So with that, and if you have questions, just ask Uli, Steffi, or me, and we can help you with that. And so those of you who'd like to stay on, and if you have more questions, feel free. Jeanne has kindly agreed to stay on for a little bit, and for 15 to 30 minutes. So thank you all for joining, and we'll continue here.